I've been very lucky because of my work and my skill and my ability that I've had the opportunity over the past 3 decades to travel around the world and immerse myself in different cultures and learn new things. But there comes a point when that wanderlust seems to dissipate and you want to put down roots somewhere. So after 5 years of searching, I decided the place would be here. Let me show you. This is Chateau Fénelon. I bought Chateau Fénelon in October 2019, and ever since I've occupied the chateau, it has been a puzzle. The estate agent's details describe the chateau as an 18th century domain. The family informed me the chateau is 17th century and was built for Francois Fénelon around 1685, which was the information that was given to them from the town when they moved in 1962. But quietly I disagreed because there are so many architectural features that suggest the chateau is much older. So during COVID, I decided to investigate further. There are so many chateaux scattered around France, and we seem to know their history. They have a provenance, but this chateau, I only have 2 threads of information. This is highly unusual. So if you want to open an investigation, you have to have a good research question because curiosity is not enough. And what I have discovered gives me serious doubts to the current history of the chateau and its place in our history and our understanding of events in history that took place around here. And this is the reason why I think there should be a complete study on the chateau, the village, and also the events that took place in the past around here. So for this reason, I'm making these series of videos so that I can possibly get help to find the information that I'm looking for, the information that I'm missing, so I can present this to academics. Because at the moment, I can't find anyone in academia who is interested in my findings. My research began with Francois Fénelon. Because he is such a notable man in French history, it was very easy to discover his movements during his life, but I never found him visiting or living anywhere further south than Cahors during his lifetime. Francois Fénelon was born at Chateau de Fénelon in the Périgord, which is a 9th century chateau built on a high motte, which was formerly the location of an 8th century Saracen fort on the south side of the Dordogne River. This to me was unusual because when I looked more carefully at the location of that chateau and its placement in the land, I noticed that the chateau is on a high motte with a small piece of land in front of it, then a small river, then another wider piece of land, and then the Dordogne River. I also noticed that some of the road names around the chateau, and one of them is called the Chemin du Port. Then I compared this with Chateau Fénelon here in Orgueil, which is a chateau on a high motte with a small piece of land in front of it, then a small river, then a larger piece of land, which then reaches to the river Tarn, with the village of Orgueil being an old port town. Is this a coincidence? I was still questioning this small discovery, but I was also questioning the information given to me that Chateau Fénelon was built in 1685. And while cleaning one of the maps within the chateau, I saw Fénelon is there. And then I noticed that some things were missing from the map, things like canals and towns which can be dated. So I began to take a look at old maps of the area and found that Fénelon in Orgueil is marked on diocese maps back to the early 1400s. This is all very strange because if the chateau is marked on maps before 1685, it cannot have been built for François Fénelon. And then checking other maps, I noticed that there are many places with the name Fénelon after the 17th century, but before the 17th century there are only 3. Chateau Fénelon here in Orgueil, Chateau de Fénelon in Saint-Mandin, and the town of La Mothe-Fénelon. So I started to look at events in history that have occurred in the area, to see if they could give me any clues. Well, the Romans were here, the Visigoths, and the Saracens were here, and then there is the Battle of Toulouse in 844. So I turned my attention to that, the Battle of Toulouse, hoping that there would be more written information about this event. And this was a conflict between Charles the Bald and his nephew Pepin II. Okay, so who were these people? Let's go back in time. In the 8th century, Charles Martel was the de facto ruler of Francia, and his grandson was Charlemagne, who became king of the Franks and the first Holy Roman Emperor. At the time of Charlemagne's death, he only had one son to inherit, who was later known as Louis the Pious. Now, Louis had 3 sons with his first wife, Ermengarde de Hesbaye, who were Lothar, Pepin, and Louis. And after the death of Ermengarde, he remarried again to Judith of Bavaria, which resulted in the birth of another son in 823, who was known as Charles the Bald. In the same year, Louis' second son, Pepin, had a son who was also known then as Pepin the Younger, and then after his father's death in 838, he was known as Pepin II. I won't go into detail or how or why this uncle and nephew went into battle, but just to say that this family had more issues than Vogue, and all of them seem to have been up at each other's throats during the whole period. So I'll leave it up to you to do your own research. Charles won the battle, and Pepin fled south, leaving Charles to take control of the county of Toulouse. But who else was involved? I began to research the documents and books to find out, and many of these documents and stories written about the battle I found to be conflicting and quite confusing. But I did notice that they all agreed that Pepin tried to seek assistance from the Vikings, who were at that time occupying the area around Bordeaux. But the Vikings declined to be involved with the battle, but they did agree to help should Pepin lose the battle or come into any problems. So Pepin went into battle with his ally Bernard of Septimania. Researching a few of the online documents of Charles the Bald's court in Aix-la-Chapelle, known today as Aachen in Germany, I see that Bernard had made many enemies in the court, and there was also a mention of the Abbot of Solignac, who was very close to Charles the Bald. So, with another new name, I started to focus on Bernard. And reading in many of the history books and online information, they all say that Bernard died on the battlefield at Toulouse. So I was curious to find out more about him and why he made so many enemies at the court. And I began to research his genealogy and discovered that on the genealogy websites, they say that Bernard did not die at Toulouse, but he was actually captured at Le Terme by Frédolin, Count of Rouergue. And then he was taken to Aix-la-Chapelle for execution. This is all very strange because why would one set of historians say that Bernard died on the battlefield and another group say he was captured at Le Terme? And why would the genealogy records mention the village of Le Terme? This is a quiet village next to the River Tarn, and it's never sought to become a political power in medieval history. It's always been a quiet little farming village. So why would this village be mentioned? The mention of Le Terme, I presume, is very significant to find out the truth of the aftermath of the Battle of Toulouse, and this challenges our understanding of what has been written into history. In gratitude to his efforts, Charles the Bald made Frédélon the Count of Toulouse and the Count of Carcassonne. Now, I found two dates for Bernard's execution, those dates being the 14th of February and the 12th of May, 844. And because there are dates associated with the execution, I believe this to be the true fate of Bernard of Septimania, and that the truth is he did not die on the battlefield at Toulouse, but this was a rumour spread by his supporters and the supporters of Pepin in order to help Bernard escape. I would presume the confusion of the two dates is that Bernard actually arrived in Aix-la-Chapelle on the 14th of February for execution, but the execution did not take place until the 12th of May, 844. This to me makes logical sense for there being two dates for execution. One example of the conflicting events about the Battle of Toulouse comes from French historian Pierre Andoc. He says that Bernard was captured in 843 by the Guérins in Uzès, and Andoc maintains that in 844, Bernard was just merely bought before Charles during his campaign throughout the Aquitaine. So I don't believe this to be correct. Bernard may have been captured in Uzès in 843, but then he must have been released soon afterwards, because there are other documents that place Bernard at the Battle of Toulouse, and the mention of Bernard's capture at Le Terme by Frédélon, and the actual dates of execution in Aix-la-Chapelle. And also, you cannot ignore the three places with the name Fénelon, two of these which we can confirm are from the 9th century. And then you cannot ignore Frédélon's rise into the aristocracy to become the Count of Toulouse and the Count of Carcassonne. So the theory presented by Andoc cannot be true. So let's return back to the Battle of Toulouse and the people involved. And let's turn our attention to Frédélon. Now, I presume he did not have a good relationship with his father and with his family. From reading Les Contes de Toulouse en Pilar et en Ribagorce au IXe siècle, I noticed that Frédélon had what we would call today narcissistic tendencies, and I would presume that his father recognized this, and that this is the reason why his father, Foucauld, did not acknowledge Frédélon as the heir to the county of Rouergue, knowing that at the time of his death, the rule of the county would be shared between Frédélon and his brother Raymond. I think Frédélon's wanting to be socially elevated and his desire to have superiority over the others in the court and nobility is important to mention, because I presume this is the reason for three places having the name Fénelon. It was customary during this period in time to name the land that marked a historical event. So to have three places associated with the same name means there must have been three significant events. It is also important to remember that Septimania was under Saracen control during the 8th century, and it's also important to remember that Rouergue was successful at keeping the Saracens out. So now I ask the questions. Why would Bernard of Septimania be in Le Terme? Where was he going? And where was he trying to get to? The mention of Le Terme is still puzzling me, and I think it comes down to two things. Firstly, being translation. Now, with so many documents being discovered in recent history, I think historians have been translating them literally. And I think the problem comes down to two words. Firstly, le terme. That word in French can mean an ending or finished. And also the second word being orgueil. Orgueil translates in French to pride. So if you read or translate the documents literally, it would say that Bernard of Septimania was captured and he was ended with pride. Well, that's quite logical. But then if you add in the maps, you get a completely different meaning. Understanding that in the 9th century, the town of Orgueil was already established as a successful port town. Now, this is very unusual, that a town would be established without being overseen by a castle, a fort, a domain, a manor, or an abbey. In history, normally a town evolves from those being employed to build a castle, a fort, or an abbey, and then those workers remain in the area, creating a system of commerce overseen by a senior member of nobility or clergy or somebody in charge of a garrison. It is unusual for a port town, or for any town, to appear and prosper without the direction of a respected leader. It's not impossible, but is highly unusual. My thought is the location of Chateau Fénelon here in Orgueil is the location of a Saracen fort, and that the town of Orgueil developed to service the fort and then proceeded to develop after the fort was abandoned by the Saracens. Knowing that Chateau de Fénelon in Saint-Mondain is built on an old Saracen fort, built on a high motte with a small piece of land, a small river, a larger piece of land, and then the larger river, this is an exact mirror image of Chateau Fénelon in Orgueil, and I presume that Chateau Fénelon in Orgueil was also the location of a Saracen fort. I'm lucky that I have elevation maps on the property done in the 1960s, and you can see along the north side of the chateau in Orgueil, the land abruptly descends 19 meters and has two semicircles at either end that resemble a rampart. Knowing that Fénelon was once a fort, it would make sense that this would be a significant landmark on the landscape that could be seen from a great distance and would be easily recognizable as a place for a rendezvous to collect somebody who was in distress. Both Bernard and Frédélon would have knowledge of the locations of the Saracen forts, as the Saracen departure from the area was still quite recent in their history, and to them and their forefathers.
The problem that I've been running into is that, I keep finding all of these threads of information, and when they're all together, they kind of make sense. But then I find these threads of information, which in some ways they kind of blend and could make sense, but they're still separate. But again, then I find these bits of information which don't really match, but they work out all right. And then you put them with these bits that I keep finding, and then these bits of information, and they all kind of work in some way. But then if you add this chateau to it, it doesn't seem to be in the right group. And if you all add them all together, they seem to make just a complete mess. Well, I'm wondering if there's any way I can make all of these threads into something that can be understood. Let's see if we can do it.
Another thing that's been puzzling me is, when was the Battle of Toulouse? We know the year, 844, but we don't have a day or a month. So I started to research that, and my research tells me that the average distance a horse could travel in the medieval period was about 26 miles or 42 kilometers. This is an average, and it's not very specific to mention whether this is a modern-day mile or a Roman mile, or nor does it take into account the standard of measurements that changed with each new ruler. Therefore, because this is an average, I'm going to take it as an average on a modern-day mile. Now, with this knowledge, I think it's important to mention that the distance from Orgueil to Cos on the old roads is about 54 kilometers, and then from Cos to La Motte-Fénelon is about 44 kilometers. This would mean the distance between Chateau Fénelon and Chateau de Fénelon is about a 2-day journey. Now, in order to arrive on February the 14th, 844 in Aachen with Bernard, this would mean then that the Battle of Toulouse would have commenced somewhere in early January. With all these threads of information and reading the maps, I propose this theory. In the 8th century, the Saracens built a fort on the Tarn River as part of their crusade north to spread the word of Islam. They began a system of commerce using the location on the river as a port, which eventually evolved into a town. Due to so many defeats by Charles Martel, the Saracens retreated and abandoned many of their former settlements, one of those being located in the current town of Argueil. The Saracens had taught the local people well, and even in the absence of the Saracens, the port town continued to thrive. Charlemagne continued the assault started by Charles Martel, bringing many counties under his protection and control, and eventually created the Holy Roman Empire. After his death, and with no definite equal or fair division between lands between his heirs, wars between the feuding brothers and their heirs would commence. There was much discord in the court of Charles the Bald, between himself and his nephew Pepin II, and the nobility, and war was inevitable. Knowing this, Pepin II sought to find himself allies to assist him. Bernard of Septimania agreed to join his cause, and Pepin also approached the Vikings located around Bordeaux to join his forces against his uncle. They declined to join in the battle, but agreed to assist him should his cause be lost, and at a pre-arranged location it was agreed to collect those in peril, that location being the abandoned Saracen fort on the River Tarn. Battle commenced between the forces of Charles the Bald and Pepin II at Toulouse in January of 844. Recognizing he was overwhelmed and that defeat was inevitable, Pepin II decided to flee south to the safety of Barcelona, and his allies to go to the pre-arranged location on the Tarn to be collected by the Vikings. To aid their escape, a rumour was spread around the battlefield that Pepin, Bernard and their allies had been killed and their bodies were lying among the carnage. Charles the Bald's ally, Fredolon, the Count of Rouergue, not believing this rumour, or uncovering this subterfuge, made haste to capture Bernard, which he did at Le Terme. At the same time, the people of the port town on the Tarn, seeing the approaching small Viking fleet, took up arms and fought off the Viking fleet. Fredolon and Charles met at the site of the old Saracen fort, where Fredolon presented his captured prisoner, Bernard, to Charles. To mark this successful event, the location of the exchange at the old fort was now called Fredolon or Fénelon. In recognition for the efforts for the people of the town, Charles gave the name Argueil, Pride, to the port town on the River Tarn. After the celebrations for the end of the battle, Bernard was being taken for trial and execution for treason at Aix-la-Chapelle. Fredolon accompanied Charles to Causes, the first stop on their way back to Aix-la-Chapelle. The second stop on the journey was a small village on a motte close to the Dordogne, where Charles decided to offer the county of Toulouse to Fredolon, which he accepted. This event was also marked by calling this place La Motte Fénelon. On hearing the story of the success, it was brought to the attention of Charles that there was also an abandoned Saracen fort nearby in Saint-Mandin. And knowing that these old forts were strategic places, Charles gave license for Fredolon to occupy this site as well, and this fort was then named Chateau Fénelon. Fredolon was given leave from Charles, and he remained in the area while Charles continued north with his prisoner and arrived in Aix-la-Chapelle on the 14th of February, where the trial was held, and Bernard was found guilty of his crimes against Charles and was executed on the 12th of May, 844. In 852, Fredolon died, and the county of Toulouse and Carcassonne were passed, with permission from Charles, to his brother Raymond. Chateau Fénelon was given to the Counts of Touraine, and the possession of Chateau Fénelon in Argueil was transferred to the family of the abbot of Solignac, the abbot who had assisted Charles with his spiritual support at the Battle of Toulouse 8 years earlier.
This is just a theory, and it's my theory from what I have understood through reading the documents and reading the maps. And I hope that I've asked enough questions that would open a new investigation into what happened at the Battle of Toulouse. So what I ask is if you could like, share and subscribe, because I don't have access to these documents, but someone out there does. So by sharing, we can get this information out there, that we can find the answers, because maybe some of it's true, maybe none of it's true, but at least we'll have an answer and maybe new avenues to go down to find out what went on. And by subscribing, you can find out what happens in the next video, which is where I ask the question, why was this chateau written out of history? Thank you.
If you have an interest in crafts, then why not take a moment to check out my website, where you can discover a whole range of needlepoint kits and cross-stitch patterns that have been inspired by my time living at Chateau Fénelon. The designs range from the traditional to the contemporary, in a variety of colors to suit your decor, and are designed for beginners and intermediates. The needlepoint kits comprise of a design that is printed on high-quality cotton mono canvas that has been cut big enough to fit comfortably into your own scroll frame, and the design is worked using 4-ply wool, which is also supplied in the kit, with 2 tapestry needles. Cross-stitch patterns are also available as PDF downloads. Keep checking the website from time to time, because as I get new samples completed, these designs will be available for purchase, and these purchases will help with the chateau restoration. Thank you.